Welcome along to the Lifting in Life podcast. I'm Cam, I'm the host, and today I'm chatting to Jeff Pelletier. Jeff is a filmmaker and trail runner from Vancouver, Canada. And in this episode, we chat about some of the specific races that he's done, with a few of those being the Moab 240, UTMB, and the Bob Graham Round, which is here in the UK, which kind of sits in a category of its own. It's not really a race, but it's also definitely not a fun run. Jeff also talks about how and why he's able to push through these massive distances, like 200 miles plus, multiple times. He also talks about his journey as a creator and filmmaker and combining that with the running. And then he provides lots of tangible advice if you're wanting to get into trail running or storytelling yourself. As always, I appreciate you tuning into the podcast, and any support you can show goes a long way, and it helps me keep getting these awesome guests on. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and remember, you make you. Alrighty, Jeff, we're here, man. I appreciate you so much for coming on the podcast today. I've been watching your stuff for probably at least a year or two now, I think. So it's awesome to actually get to sit down and chat with you.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah.
No worries, man. I've been watching, a range of your content. You do the fast packing stuff, you do the competitive ultras, you do things like the Bob Graham Round, which maybe are kind of sitting in its own sort of sphere. It's kind of a race, but not really. But so like I was saying to you before we started, the difficult part about today was actually narrowing down what to talk about. Like you were saying, we could pick one race and probably talk about that for 2 hours. But I thought we would start off with a few races that I'm personally most interested in for various reasons. Because seeing, say, Bob Graham Round, for instance, we're based in Manchester, so we've gone to the lakes a few times. That's why I thought that one was cool. But to start off nice and basic, I just want to get a bit of an understanding as to how you got into trail running and this traveling. Like, where did your journey start with all this stuff?
Well, I started running in my late 20s as a road runner. I did a few marathons, and then I discovered trail running and ultimately ultra distance running. You know, when I heard that people were running further than a marathon, that was pretty intriguing. And it's a slippery slope from there. You know, you start with 50 kilometers and then 80K, and then before you know it, you're doing 100-mile and, in my case, 200-mile races. And not everybody follows the same journey. You don't need to be doing multi-day races. But to me, that's what appeals to me. There's this sort of idea of doing a 100-mile race where, you know, there's something special about running through the night and seeing the sunrise. And with multi-day races, that happens a few times. And so that's pretty special as well. And since then, I've sort of transitioned into a little bit more kind of adventure style running. So doing multi-day fast packing adventures, which is really just a combination of backpacking and trail running. We're just moving a little bit quicker on the trail and maybe a little bit lighter. You know, it's like ultra light. Sometimes hut to hut as well. Hut to hut is a great approach for trail runners. Along with what I'd consider like project-based events, like things like the Bob Graham Round, where they're not a race, it's not organized, but it's a project you can take on and really sink your teeth into. And those become more of a personal endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of your fast packing ones were really interesting too. Like I love the Moab 240, where it's about getting the best result that you can, but then you do the multi-day fast packing stuff, which is you're still moving quickly, but it's over a longer distance, and maybe it's a different kind of enjoyable, but it's also enjoyable, but maybe perhaps a bit more relaxed. So yeah, there's a lot in there that we could unpack.
Sure, and the fast packing is a little bit more, I think, as I said, like more of an adventure. Races are a great way to push yourself in a controlled environment. They're mostly flagged. They typically have GPS trackers. There are sometimes search and rescue crews, almost always first aid, on standby. There's aid stations providing water and food at regular intervals. It's a controlled environment where you can push yourself to the edge of kidney failure if you want to. I mean, you can go as far as you want to in these. But knowing that there's always a safety net there for you, and some races less so. Some races you're a little bit more, you know, you have to be a little bit more kind of on top of things. But for the most part, these races are controlled environments, and that's why it's a great way to try a new distance. You don't
Mm.
typically run 50 kilometers in your training before doing your first 50K. You're there to see if you can, and maybe how fast you can do it. But it's nice to raise the stakes sometimes and to do bigger adventures in the backcountry, say, where you're on your own and you need to then be smart about it and build in your own safety net. Think about plan B, C, D. How are you going to get yourself out of there if you run into trouble? And you're typically then you're not pushing to the edge. You are keeping things more controlled because you need to be responsible for your own safety. So two different approaches. One is a little bit more of a true adventure where there's stakes involved, there's safety involved. That's more the fast packing side of things. Then the other where it's more about just the pure physical challenge, knowing that there's a team there. I mean, that's what you're paying for with these races. You're paying for that safety net. And so different ways to push yourself mentally, physically, both with their pros and cons. And I like to use the fast packing, the adventure style stuff as training for the races. So doing it
Yeah.
a little bit more, slowing it down, like I said, managing my own safety, but training and suffering in beautiful places, as we like to say, in Patagonia, in the Alps, like wherever it might be, and then applying all that physical fitness to these more controlled race environments where I can just push myself right to the edge.
Yeah. Speaking to pushing yourself, where I thought maybe we could start this is kind of setting a bit of a baseline as to what you've done when it comes to the longest you've run. Maybe in terms of time, like hours,
Mm-hmm.
and also in terms of distance. I'm not sure if they might be the same or different, but could you give us an insight into what the longest races you've done, both in terms of time and then also distance, if they're different?
Sure. Well, I've done a few 7 day stage races where you're racing each day but then you stop and you sleep. So cumulatively, that can be very difficult over the course of 7 days. You have to get up each day and do it again. But then I've also done a few of these 200 plus mile format races where they're essentially a single stage. So you can stop and nap, but the clock keeps ticking. So the name of the game is to try to run as much as you can and sleep as little as possible. In my case, that's usually a few hours over the course of a few days, maybe an hour a day having a nap. The longest race in terms of distance I've done was the Moab 240, 240 miles, pushing 400 kilometers. But that was the quickest, the fastest race in terms of average pace because we're in the desert and we're really running almost every step. The longest race I've done in terms of distance was one called the Swiss Peaks 360, which is 360 kilometers in the Swiss Alps, and a ton of elevation change. And so while that was a little shorter at 360 kilometers, that one took me 4.5 days. I think I slept about 5 hours over those 4.5 days. And that, yeah, I believe it was 113 hours finishing time,
Hmm.
which put me in the top, I think I was 18th overall out of a couple hundred. So gives you a sense. I mean, those races have about 150-hour cutoff typically. So you can be out there for up to a week. And yeah, so some races are they get much longer in terms of distance, and some of them are more runnable than others. So you do have to factor in what we call time on feet,
Yeah.
as well as
That's your
distance. And that's
slogan, right? I love that. It
exactly,
sums it
yeah,
up so well, the
yeah.
time on feet.
Yeah,
So
well, at the end of the
accurate.
day, a lot of what we do is just time on feet, like we like to say. It's just
Yeah.
training is really just about getting out there. There's no shortcuts. You got to put in the time, and that's really my approach to training. It's like I said, trying to do it in beautiful places, but at the end of the day, there's no shortcuts. You got to really invest.
Yeah, I was I'd already watched your Swiss Peaks video, but in prepping for the pod, I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna watch it again because I'm pretty sure that's one of your longest ones." I was watching that, I think it was
Hmm.
yesterday, and man, just and obviously we're only seeing snippets of it too in the video, but just the places that I can only imagine that you have to go to in order to persevere through that. Like I remember there was a couple of times where, or maybe it was once where you slept for an hour and then you're just like, no, I need to sleep for another hour, wait for sunrise, and then you started talking and you're saying, oh man, I might regret that extra hours of sleep, and it's just wild, man. You've been running for I don't know, maybe it was 70 hours or something at that
Yeah.
point. So what does it take in order to keep persevering through that when you're sleep deprived, when no
Mhm.
doubt you're physically and mentally drained? Like, what kind of places do you need to go to push through that?
First and foremost, it's and you hear this a lot. It's knowing your why, and that can sound cheesy, but literally,
Mm.
it's why are you here? What's your goal? I found actually the Swiss Peaks 360K to be a more challenging race to push through because I had just done that was my second 200 plus mile race. I had run one called the Tor Des Geants the year before in the Italian Alps. And that was my first 200-mile race. So that one, I knew my why. It was, can I run this distance? And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I do finish it. I was truly motivated. In the hardest times, it was no. I got to prove to myself and to everyone else, prove to my community, my friends, my family that I can do this. Everyone I've committed to, and I was making a film. I wanted to tell a good story. The next year, I went back and did that race, the Swiss Peaks 360K, and I remember partway through at one of my many low points feeling like what am I doing here? I don't have anything else to prove. I've done this close to that distance anyway. Tour de Jean was a little bit shorter, but I started questioning my why. Like, what do I need to do another one of these? I've kind of proven it. I thought I had a strong why. I wanted to go and do a longer one in a different place, but maybe it wasn't quite defined enough, and I questioned finishing. I managed to push through that and to finish, but I learned from that experience. I learned that some people are maybe bucket listers and they want to just keep checking these off their list or be able to say, I've done 20 ultra marathons or whatever. To me, that wouldn't be a strong enough why. I need to choose events that have a deeper meaning, where I'm inspired by the history of the race, the landscape, whatever it might be, trying a new distance, some new challenge, heat, altitude. I need to show up knowing why I'm there, and why I'm not going to let myself fail, because there are so many times, so many chances. Fatigue does a lot of things to your brain. We've all been there. We've all struggled after a bad night's sleep to get through the next day at work. And with this, it's that to the extreme. It's your body's going into survival mode. It's trying to shut it down. It's your body knows what's healthy and what's not healthy. And these races aren't the healthiest thing. This is maybe overdoing it a little bit. Nobody claims that multi-day running is healthy. We're not doing it for that reason necessarily. I think running as overall is healthy, but this is where you need to know why you're there and why you're doing it. And that's why I took a couple years off after that, because I realized that was a close one. It was one of the hardest events I've ever had to push through. Where I went to and how I got through it was just being inspired by the places we were in. We'd be climbing up to 3,000 meters, middle of the morning. You're up there alone. There's nobody around. It's just you on top of a mountain, and you look down, and there's a beautiful sunrise, maybe an inversion with the clouds over the town below, and you're practically brought to tears. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world, and that's what kept me going, and being able to tell a story through that. But I did take a couple of years off from 200-mile races after that until I was ready to tackle the Moab 240. And for me, that was about my why was, how fast can I do one of these? And in the end, that race ended up being one of my better performances ever. But I really tackled that one from a different perspective. That was about the physical challenge. But it turned out to be an amazingly beautiful place to suffer as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so when it comes to race selection now, is the
Mhm.
one of the main things at the forefront of your mind the why do I want to participate, or
100%.
why do I
I've
want
got
to
a
do
list
this?
of races. It keeps growing,
Yeah,
like all
yeah,
of us, our bucket lists in life. As you check off one, you add two more things. And races are especially like that because you meet people and you learn about other events. And there's
hmm
always new events cropping up. But basically, the ones that are on my list all have essentially a reason behind them. I want to do Badwater because I want to run the hottest race in the world to see if I can. How do you
yeah,
train for that? It's not going to be the most inspiring race in terms of landscapes, but that challenge alone would motivate me to see if I can finish it. There's Hard Rock 100 has been my goal my entire running career, and that's got to be the most incredible, beautiful, and challenging event in the world. You're at
hmm
altitude up to 14,000 feet. It's in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, and it's incredibly beautiful. We fast packed the course this year and saw the whole thing, and I can't wait to go and race that one. And again, I want to tell a good story around that race as well. It's got an incredible history. So there's a reason that I want to go and do a lot of these races. The Comrades race in South Africa. I mean, that's just got history, gushing with history. That race.
hmm
You're running on a road for 80 kilometers. It's not the most inspiring course, but there's a story behind it. There's a history, and I want to experience that history and that culture. And so there's different reasons that I want to tackle different things. And yeah, the Bob Graham Round, for example, that challenge, that was more, as I said, a personal project in the UK. That was more about the culture and the history as well, because that's fell running, which is again different than trail running. And I want to experience that and live and breathe that for a month. And so that's why I took on that challenge.
Yeah, wow, that's really insightful. I'd like to zoom in a little bit on the Moab 240, seeing as you alluded to it there. The thing that I found really cool about the Moab 240 is because you're a creator. Maybe it's easy to assume that you do it more for like the enjoyment or to tell a story, but then you go to something like Moab 240 and you come second place and you almost come first place within minutes, which is wild in a over 200-mile race. So what was that experience like for you and going into it with that mindset, like you say, that competitive mindset and wanting to do a
Yeah.
fast race?
Um, well, people often ask me, am I a filmmaker or am I a runner who happens to
Yeah,
film? You know, am I a filmmaker who happens to run,
yeah,
or a
yeah,
runner
yeah.
who likes to create content? And I, I would say first and foremost, I've been a filmmaker for longer than I've been a runner. I took up running more recently in life. I've been making videos all my life and films all my life. Um, but I am also a runner. I mean, those two things can coexist. So I don't just make films about running because I'm looking for something to make a video about. I also want to make videos about running. I want to inspire other people to run, and I want to consider to push myself as an athlete. So those two things I think can coexist. So, and maybe that's something that differentiates my channel a little bit. It's hard to run. Towards the front of the field while making a film. That which is why
Yeah.
I think we typically see content creators often are more mid to back of pack because filming does take away from that running and from your performance. It's a distraction.
Hmm.
Editing is a distraction. Sitting in my edit suite all winter
Yeah.
doesn't exactly lead to great training, which is why I kind of typically film a lot during the summer and then I edit a lot during the winter. I try to balance the two. Um, but I think that's maybe something I do well, which is to find a balance between still pushing myself physically, but also being able to tell a compelling story. And so that was my goal at Moab. It was, can I run this fast, but also do it while filming? And I think we succeeded there. Um, could I have shaved off the 5 minutes I needed if I wasn't filming? Sure. But Jesse, who finished in first just ahead of me, he probably could have found 5 or 10 minutes as well. We'll never know. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't. I think the result made for a better story.
Hmm.
Uh,
That was intense, man.
right, as opposed to just me say Jesse had dropped, which he had considered doing, and if
Yeah.
I would have finished with a 3 hour gap on second,
It's
on
like
Aaron
watching
who
your
finished in
favorite
third.
sports team or something just win
Yeah.
5-0 in a football game. Ah, wow,
So
okay.
I think for me, it was like finishing in second instead of first at that race, for example, but coming out of it with a great story.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
that's a win, as
Yeah.
opposed to saying, well, if I would have left the camera at home and just done the race. So I want to do both. I want to do both. I
Hmm.
want to push myself, not necessarily win a race, but do my own personal best while also telling a story. For me, that's a win if I can keep finding that balance.
Yeah, that must be such an interesting dynamic. So one of the guys, Simon Cochran is his name, he did the UTMB, like I was telling you, and he
Hmm.
bought, I think it was like an Insta 360, and I was
Sure.
stoked. I was like, oh, cool, man, are you gonna film the race? And he's like, nah, no way. But
Yeah.
I suppose when like you'd be so well versed in it now, and it'd almost be part of your running that it wouldn't feel
Yeah.
like this additional chore, I suppose, that you're adding on top of it because I assume it's quite a routine for you now, right?
Yeah, and I should say as well, I mean I really do I want to inspire people to whether they're running ultra marathons or not, but to get outside, to hike, to
Yeah.
explore, to push themselves, to sweat, just to be active. Set some lofty goals and try to accomplish them. I'm not trying to motivate people and inspire people to create their own YouTube channels and to document it all. I think there's
Yeah,
enough
yeah,
people
yeah.
now showing up at these races with Insta 360 cameras.
Yeah, yeah.
We've got it covered. There's enough content. Sure, if you also love telling stories, great, do that. But I do get a lot of messages asking for advice, saying, I'm going to be running Tor Des Geants for my first time, and I also would like to make a film. What camera should I use? And usually, I kind of say maybe just focus on finishing the race, like because it's going to be
Yeah.
hard enough just to finish it. Um, So let's start laying the foundation with that. My success for me is not everybody shows up at the start line with a GoPro,
Yeah.
um, because it is hard enough just finishing these races. And for me, like you said, I've had a camera in my hand since I was 15, and I'm 43 now. So
Mhm.
uh, I'm pretty used to having a camera in my hand, and I've had a camera in my hand while running since I started running about you know 16 years ago. So it's second nature, and also the getting the footage I need is also second nature. So when I'm at my lowest point and I roll into an aid station after a couple of days, and then I look around and go, oh my God, this looks like a war zone. I better get some B-roll. And I snap into, I take off my runner's hat, I put on my filmmaker's hat, and it just brings me to life. And I can get some B-roll, and people are looking at me thinking like, are you racing? Or I thought you were in the race. What's happening here? And then I stop filming, and then it hits me again, like, oh my God, I'm so tired. I
Yeah.
almost forgot for a minute there. So I sometimes I think it actually helps me a little bit. It gives me something to focus on other than the discomfort,
It's like a
other
welcome
than
distraction.
totally. And if a
Yeah.
race isn't going well, hey, I can still have a secondary goal I can achieve, which is to tell a good story. Even failing to meet a goal, a DNF, whatever it might be, injury can make for a compelling story as well that others can learn from. So yeah, it's a welcome distraction for me, but only because I've been doing it for so long. I think for some people it would be such a distraction that it could actually jeopardize their primary goal of just simply finishing the race.
Yeah, well, even like, so there's been a lot of technical barriers to even doing a podcast, for instance. Like,
Hmm.
imagine trying to run a race and you like don't know if your GoPro's filming or like you
Yeah.
forgot an SD card or I don't know, man.
Yeah.
Like, there'd be so many variables there that could just throw you out. That's such a good point. It's quite funny that your goal isn't for everyone to show up with a GoPro. I like that. So, changing tack a little bit, Mont Blanc. We have been to Chamonix. It was like a bucket list place. We moved from New Zealand to the UK, so we're here for a couple of years, doing a bunch of travel. And Chamonix was on the bucket list, and we stayed in Les Houches, so we saw the like Tour de Mont Blanc sign and stuff. So that's why I thought it would be interesting to chat to you about Mont Blanc specifically, because would you say that it's the most famous like ultra running event, right?
Yeah, so the UTMB Chamonix is probably the Super Bowl of trail
Mm-hmm.
running. We have big races in North America as well, Western states, hard rock, but they're harder to get into. They don't have nearly as many runners. So while they're watched events, they're not run by as many runners. Races in the Alps, they don't suffer from the permitting issues that we have in North America. And so that race is it's got a couple of thousand runners in the 100-mile distance. It's an incredible thing to be a part of. It's not for everyone. It's busy. It's chaotic. It's a little stressful. But there's 10,000 spectators watching you and cheering you
Mm-hmm.
on and supporting you as volunteers, which is an incredible experience as well. So that was part of what I wanted to experience the first time. It starts in Chamonix and it runs entirely around the Mont Blanc Massif through Italy, through Switzerland, and back to France, which again is incredible. And it's on the Tour de Mont Blanc. Basically, it follows for the most part that route, which is an incredible route. Roughly 100 miles, roughly 10,000, so 166 kilometers, actually closer to 170 kilometers, I believe. I think it's maybe 105, 106 miles, and about 10,000 meters of elevation gain plus equal descent. So it's also considered one of the hardest races in the world. Um, it's competitive at the front, so you've got some of the best runners there, and then you've got just a couple thousand people behind them, just hoping to
That's
finish.
insane, man.
It's an incredible energy, and so that was a real bucket list race for me, and I got to do that back in 2022 with my partner Audrey. And but we go to Chamonix every year. We love Chamonix. A mecca for trail running, for other events, for the trails there are incredible. There's gondolas everywhere. It's just a really cool place. So and there's places like that all over the Alps. Yeah, there's places like that in the States as well that are considered sort of meccas for trail running, but I think I'd put Chamonix at the top of that list probably.
Yeah. How does running such a popular race like that, where you're probably almost always with at least some people, compare
Always.
to again, Simon, he was saying that the start of the race from Chamonix to Les Houches is just hectic, right, on that single
Crazy.
track. But
Yeah.
yeah, how does that compare to something like Swiss Peaks where
Hmm.
there are far fewer competitors, so there's going to be a lot more alone time? How do they
Hmm.
compare?
Well, I'd even compare it to the Tor des Geants, which is the UTMB of 200 milers, because they have about 900 runners that start. So it's close to half the field. This is the one that I did my first 200 miler in Italy. But by about day two, you're so spread out. Everybody's running at different paces. People stop at the life bases and sleep at different times. You're so spread out, but that towards the end of the race, it feels like there's 20 or 30 people in the race. You never see, I mean, assuming you're running a fairly steady pace, that you're not
Hmm.
falling too back or surging too far forward, it really feels like a small field. And you get to know people, you get to know their crew. You're just seeing the same faces over and over again. At least when you're racing kind of mid to front of the pack, it might be a little bit of a different experience towards the back. Um, Swiss Peaks 360K was even a smaller field, 250 runners or so, and that's closer to what we have in North America for most
Right.
ultras. We're typically limited by permit sizes for the national parks. That's often the case, or for regional parks even. And so you're often seeing lineups of 250 runners. A race with 500 runners is considered big. That's a
Right.
big event. And so it's a totally different experience. And you do end up spreading out a lot. 100-mile races in the US, for example, you're almost always running throughout the night alone. And this is one reason why in North America, the culture is very different. You end up, most races allow a pacer. So you have
Right.
typically a friend or several friends um, take sections starting at around the halfway point, and they can run with you. Their goal is to help you navigate. It's for safety. It's to keep you awake. It's to keep you moving, and also to push you and help you literally set a pace, like a pace car in a race. Um, you rarely do you see pacers in Europe, and it's a different culture. It's a little more you're a little more self sufficient in Europe. That's a little more the mentality, but also the fields are larger. So, like you said, you're usually never alone anyway. And there's gondolas, there's refuges, there's a lot more infrastructure
Yeah.
available in the Alps. Whereas in North America, we're often it's just us in a forest, us and the bears for a few hundred miles.
Yeah.
So very different cultures there, very different experiences depending on the race size, but also on the location. And that's what I would say would be the biggest difference between racing in North America versus in somewhere like the Alps is
Hmm.
the experience of whether you want competition. You're going to get that deeper competition in the Alps typically versus solitude and that experience of it's just you in the wild. Typically, you get more of that in North America, with some exceptions.
I did wonder why there was that difference in the amount of competitors, because it sounds like the ones in the States can be quite competitive to get into, right? Like it's
Sure.
almost like you have to qualify or you have to,
Mm-hmm.
there's even a raffle potentially. So when it comes to running those races with more solitude, like you say, is that more of a mental component involved there? At least
Mm-hmm.
perhaps maybe the first ones you did. What were those like mentally, especially say running through the night by yourself? That sounds like it has to take a lot of mental toughness to persevere through that.
Yeah, and I mean, again, you can get that experience with more of the 200-mile races in the Alps because you do spread out. But for the most part, those races, you're almost always with somebody. And so it is very much you go to a different place when you're running alone. For me, that sort of that depth of solitude, it's hard to find that in
Hmm.
day-to-day life. I don't have kids, but especially if you had kids, I can only imagine getting
Yeah.
away, from it all for 12 hours to be just alone with your thoughts would be a special experience. But that can be hard for some people, and for a lot of us, that's actually something we seek out. And so solitude can be refreshing. It can be a meditative experience. For me, running really is meditation in a lot of cases. You're thinking about your body, you're focusing on your breath and your nutrition, you know your body as opposed to necessarily getting lost in your thoughts. But at the same time, you can also get lost in your thoughts for hours, and you can come out of that having solved many of life's problems.
Yeah.
At least it can feel that way after a long solitude, a long stretch of solitude in the mountains. And that's the same thing with our training runs. Sometimes we're going out by ourselves and doing these 2, 3, 5 hour training runs. And I like doing those alone sometimes and maybe just
Mm.
listening to a podcast or not, just sort of being alone with my thoughts.
That is something I think about quite often. Like now we say we'll wake up, we'll probably go on our phone or watch TV before
Hmm.
work. We go to work, most of us look at a screen, then we go home and then to relax we look at a screen again and then hop into bed, maybe scroll our phone again before we go to sleep. So is that, it's not even necessarily screen time, but it's more just the cognitive load that we're always under. Is that something that you think is, and it sounds like it is really beneficial for your mental well-being and your clarity and things like that, having that time
Yeah.
away where you're not always just stimulating your brain.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, it's actually more about being able to focus on one goal. I'm a very goal-oriented person. I have um, a business on the side, a separate business. I have the YouTube side of things. I have lots of things I'm working on, lots of things I'm thinking about. But when I go and do, for example, a 7 day stage race, that's 7 days focused on one goal, which is getting to
Mm,
that finish line. But you're hyper focused on it to the point where I mean you have to think about recovery each day and how's my body doing? I got to stretch, got to get my protein in, and then of course while you're running, it's got to get fuel and hydration day in day out for 7 days straight. And very rarely in my life do I get to focus on one singular goal where I don't even have cell service for 7 days necessarily. Sometimes you do, but typically you don't. And that's all that matters. Nothing else matters. I'll tell my team at the office like only like here's how you can contact me in case the building literally burns down. But if it's not on fire, I'll see you in a week.
yeah,
Um, and that's for a busy professional like myself. That's a rare thing where I can focus on one goal and throw myself 100% at that goal for 7 days straight. To me, that's the reason to do something like a multi-day race, a staged race, whatever that might be. It's really just be able to focus on one thing and turn
yeah,
off the phone and have no distractions. Yeah, again, very rare that we get to do that in life. With our jobs, we're getting pulled into different meetings, into different asks, and then we're going home and we have family commitments. And
yeah.
so, if you want to feel and experience the opposite of that, it would be similar to doing a big through hike, where
Hmm.
you just are focusing on that through hike for days, weeks, months, sometimes at a time. But for me, 7 days is about right, and then I'm ready to get back to life usually.
Yeah, I was listening to a Huberman podcast the other day, and it was on goal setting, and it's pretty much exactly what you're saying. And he was saying how so often now we have priorities, plural, and
Mm-hmm.
the definition of priority is to eliminate everything else. It's like you
Oh,
can't
yeah.
have multiple priorities, but that's kind of how we operate now, right? But it sounds like you get a lot of, I don't know, energy, or I don't know what it is, but you get a lot out of just that focusing on one thing, even if it is just like that 7 days, like you say.
Yeah, and it's the idea of doing less but better. And in this
Yes,
case,
yeah,
I mean that's in my case, I often have two goals. I'm racing and I'm trying to film. So I guess
yeah,
you could argue I have two projects, but yeah, no, it's what would happen if I put everything else aside and just focus on this one thing. We don't get to do that, unfortunately, in our training. I mean, most of us, even myself, I'm not a professional athlete. I'm,
mm-hmm.
like I said, first and foremost, a professional filmmaker who happens to film running. Um, but I think it's a similar thing where what would happen if you were only training for your sport? I
Yeah,
mean, how much better? How much could you improve?
yeah. Is that element of focus something that you take into other areas of your life? Say with your, I don't know, business. Is it like for this 10 weeks we're prioritizing this goal, or is that element of focus something that transfers over?
I try to. I mean, I try to focus on, like you said, it's a process of prioritization.
Hmm.
Sometimes when we have a to-do list that's 10 deep, you can say, what if I could only do five? And you cut it down.
Yeah.
Great. Now take the five, cut it down to three. Okay, now that you've
Hmm.
got three, what's the one most important thing you could do? And that's the thing you should be starting with. Make sure, because life gets away from us, You get a call, you have to go run off and do something. You're putting out fires. We're often
Yeah.
firefighting in our lives. So I think it's a good process to do, whether it's the evening before or the first thing in the morning, is to really set a list of priorities. There's an analogy about big rocks and putting big rocks into a
A
jar,
jar.
and then
Yeah.
the sand. And so setting your priorities, your big rocks. Yeah, that's definitely something that's a practice we do with our morning huddles with my team. And it's
Yeah.
something I do try to do personally each day.
Yeah, that it has been an interesting learning because I was in the fitness space, like personal training, that kind of stuff, and then coming into the corporate world, it is interesting
Mm-hmm.
learning those agile frameworks and
Yeah.
retros and all that kind of stuff. And it's funny how that is actually stuff that applies to the fitness space. Like it could apply to your running almost. How has my running been for the last month or 8 weeks or something and reflecting on it. So certainly something that can cross over.
Yeah, we only have so much ability to make choices in a day, right? So we can, and we run out of that mental power at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So we think like, great, I'll go to the gym tonight. I'll go out, after dinner. But when we get there, we're literally tired from having made choices all day from prioritization. This is just something that we might have the time to do it, but we lack that decision making power by the end of the day. So I think exercise is a great example. Getting up and doing that first thing in the morning when it's easier, you still have that reserve of decision making ability. Doing it for getting it out of the way in the morning ensures you're actually going to do it. So for some people, their big rock, their priority might need to be going out for that run, going to the gym, and that means doing it first thing in the morning. It doesn't mean scheduling it for later on because you probably will find an excuse to not do it later on. So
But
I
is
think
it
that
like
it
eating the
definitely
frog or
applies to that.
something, right? It's like
Yeah,
eating the
exactly. Yeah.
frog, like eat the frog early in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Totally.
that's
Totally.
true.
Yeah. And you can only do so many things. You can only focus on so many things in life as well. I've realized, I think prioritization can be applied on a bigger scale. Um, I read somewhere somebody was talking about how it's really typically three things. You can have three things in life. For
Yeah.
most people, that's family, work, and maybe friends, or maybe it's a
Hmm.
hobby. But even there, it's like you can't have friends and a hobby if you have a family and a job. Something has to give, and we
Yeah.
often will look back and say, "Well, yeah, I haven't had a social life in a long time because I've been so focused on maybe it's work and family and a hobby." Or the inverse, I haven't had time for my hobby or for my health. And so I think for a lot of people, it might be two, it might be four things, but for many of us, it's maybe three big buckets we can focus on. And so for me, I mean, that's work and that's sport and then I guess creativity, sort of telling stories as well. Um, I, as I said, we don't have kids. If we did, I've thought about what would have to give. Would I stop making as many
Yeah.
YouTube videos? Would I stop running as much? Maybe that means both. What would I
Okay.
give up?
Yeah.
Um, I don't have as much time as I'd like to, or I find myself not spending focusing as much, prioritizing as much time on playing guitar, for example, because it's just not one of my main three things.
Hmm.
Whereas if it was one of my main three, I'd spend 3 or 4 hours a day doing it. And so I think some people might challenge that idea, but if you really think about your life and your day and the average day, what you really focus on, I think for most of it, it's about three things. And so if we want to be more successful with athletics, whether it's running or lifting or whatever, I think the key is it needs to be part of your lifestyle. It can't just be some small part of your life. It's got to
Yeah.
be one of the big three things. If you want it to be if you want it to be a big part of your life, you have to make it big part of your life. And it might mean getting a job in the outdoor industry. It might mean finding friends. And that's often what happens as runners is we realize most of my friends are
Yeah.
runners.
Like
So you're actually
enablers.
yeah, and you're
Yeah.
checking
Yeah.
off two boxes at once. So when we run, that is our social thing. We go to these
Yeah.
big group runs and then we go out for beers. And I don't have to try to balance friends with running. It's one and the same. And it supports the two goals support each other. And I think that's for me, that's the key is finding ways to make my passions and my priorities overlap. So running and creating content overlaps with my social group. So those aren't in conflict anymore. They're supporting each other.
Oh, that's a really good perspective. I like that. It's like a macro level perspective on the the things that you can fit into your life. I don't know whether they're hobbies or your professional or your family life, but it's like from a really zoomed out perspective. It's not what can I do today. It's over the next year. What are the main things that I could fit in? And I suppose if you were to change those things or to swap one out, it would be a matter of sacrificing something else, like you were saying about having kids. What would I have to take out? So if you
Mm-hmm.
want to run a marathon and you currently, I don't know, lift weights 5 or 6 days a week, uh, maybe you're going to have to train 3 or 4 days a week and have to run
That's right.
more. So
That's
it's
right.
a matter of sacrificing if and when needed, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the challenge as well with sport, with running in particular, running it's hard on the body.
Mm.
It can lead to injury. Most
Mm.
runners get injured. I don't know. Let's say once a year you have some kind of niggle that often develops into an injury. Hopefully it doesn't. I've had good seasons, but typically there's at least one thing I'm managing at any given time, especially as an aging athlete. It's simply part of being an athlete is managing your body, trying to avoid injury, and then managing injury when you get them. And I think one of the hardest parts is that when we do rely so much on our bodies when we're injured, it can feel like the world has ended, and also like a piece of us, our identity is gone, and a
Yeah.
piece of our. Well, here's an example. If using the analogy I had, which was, a lot of my friends are now runners, and that allows me to overlap the two. But when I'm injured and I'm not running, I don't see my friends.
Yeah.
And that's actually the hard part often is I realize, yes, I'm not achieving my goals as a runner, but the other thing is I'm missing my friends. So then we have to find ways to engage that community. And one way is to volunteer at races.
Yeah.
Or in our case, go out for the beer after the run, but you don't have to do the run. Maybe show up and set up a little aid station while they go run. And then you can go and hang out with them after. So you can still engage your community. But I think it's acknowledging sometimes, again, as runners, it's often the community we miss when we're injured, and then focusing on getting engaged again with the community and not focusing so much on the injury itself, because that's a process and you need to give that time.
Yeah, my partner Chloe, she's a professional bikini bodybuilder, and she went to
Okay.
see a sports psychologist a few years ago because she was competing in the States, and she's pretty much saying exactly what you said, but she described, our life is like a pie, and when you're an athlete, that pie is like 80 or 90% your sport, and when that thing, say like an injury happens, what happens? Like, what have you got
Mm.
to fall back on there? So it's interesting that you're speaking to it more like a Venn diagram almost, where there's like some overlap. So yeah, I didn't really think about that aspect of if your friends are also tied to the sport and you can't do the sport, then it's negatively impacting two areas of your
Two
life.
parts of it, yeah. I
Yeah,
had an injury years ago when I was early on in my running career, and I remember going to a physio, and I can't run, my life is over, and she's like, "You runners, you need a backup sport. You need a backup sport. This is your chance to
yeah.
take up cycling."
Oh
And I
yeah,
thought,
yeah,
that's not a bad idea. So I took up
yeah,
cycling and I did a Grand Fondo, a 100K Grand Fondo, the Whistler Grand Fondo that goes along the
yeah.
Sea to
Oh,
Sky
nice.
Highway here in Vancouver. Beautiful, of course.
Yeah,
Awesome experience. I met new people, took up a new sport, learned a whole training methodology. And now I consider myself kind of a part time cyclist. I always have that to fall back on. Maybe I'll do a triathlon one day. That
yeah,
injury was one of the best things that could have happened to me because I've moved past that. The goals I had at the time in hindsight were minor. It didn't affect me long term. And it led to me having this backup sport and realizing that, so we kind of talking about the area of your life that might be impacted is the social life. So you need a way to
yeah,
still engage with that. In my case, the area that was being affected was the goal setting and pushing myself physically. I thought, well, if I can't run, but there's other ways I can achieve that same goal. In this case, through cycling.
yeah.
So yeah, I think it's looking at what are you getting from each of these aspects, and how can you replace them. And in my case, and I think most runners should have a backup sport. I think
It sounds
it's not cool
sensible.
running. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, maybe zooming in another race. We've already mentioned it a couple of
Yeah,
times. The Bob Graham round. We moved over to Manchester 18 months ago, and
sure.
we heard about the Peak District and the Lake District, and then so we've done one night's wild camping in the Lake District. That was pretty fun, and then we've done one trail run there, the Fairfield Loop, with
Okay.
a horseshoe. And that was
Yeah.
nothing compared to the Bob Graham round, but just saying that we've been to the Lake District a couple of times, so I personally really enjoyed that video. What was it like participating in something like that? And really, I don't know, it felt like you got really immersed in the space. Like you spent a long
Yeah.
time there, you paced other people, but then the format of the race is just kind of you book it in and then it's up to you to get it done. So what was your experience of that like compared to standard races?
Well, my goal with the Bob Graham round was to find a project that I could sink my teeth into that wasn't a race. So
Hmm.
you used the term race a couple times, which it very much is not. It's simply a route that's been roughly defined. I mean, you can choose your own, but you need to basically hit these 42 peaks. And there's at this point, a pretty well established fastest way to do that. So most people do it sort of the same direction and following pretty much the same route. And so it's a physical challenge of pushing through these 42 peaks and getting it done in under 24 hours.
Hmm.
It's named after Bob Graham, who did this when he turned 42. I think he actually tried to do 41 for his 41st birthday and failed, and then the next year added on another peak. I think that's the story as well. And I was turning 42. I thought, what a cool time to go and do this. I'd heard about it a few years back, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when Kilian Jornet, one of the best mountain runners in the world, he went and broke the record that had been long-standing. And so that's what got it on my radar. And I always thought, man, it'd be cool to go over there and do that. But it's a totally different culture of running. It's called fell running in the fells, in the mountains in the Lake District there. And the idea is that there's no defined trails, or very few defined trails. There's just a few. And you can choose your own adventure and go off trail. And if you think there's a faster way to run down this slope, then do it. And that's what a lot of the races are like. They're not flagged. As long as you hit checkpoints, you can choose a route based on your own strengths or weaknesses. That's very different, I should say, than running in North America, where again, we're running through national parks typically, or parks or trails that are, it's the opposite. You need to stay on the trail because we're worried about erosion. If people were just running everywhere, it would be a mess and it would create erosion, which is bad for the trails and the slopes, and you get runoff, and it would be a very bad thing. We're trying to protect nature. We're trying to protect habitat. In fact, there was a race a few years back where Kilian Jornet came over and did a run in the States, and he was cutting the switchbacks and he got disqualified.
Oh,
And he
wow.
was like, man, I didn't realize you weren't allowed to, because
Yeah.
where I come from, this is what we do. Very different culture. In the Lake District, it's beautiful, but having said that, it was deforested centuries ago
Yeah.
for livestock. So it's mostly grassy fields.
Yeah.
And so the races there, they run everywhere, off course, over rocks. Um, so that's the Bob Graham round, 42 peaks, 24 hours or faster to be considered an official finisher. You can do it whenever you want, but you have to register your attempt with the association that governs this. And you need witnesses. So you have to find a group of reliable people, which is hard these days, to come out and to pace you. And that's as much for safety and as it is to witness your attempt. Now we have GPS and GPX files you can upload and things, but this is a long-standing rule. You need witnesses, and so those witnesses, those pacers, end up actually helping you as well. They can carry your stuff. Friends can provide support. So you're putting together this team, and in doing so, you realize how much value you get. With these races are hundreds of dollars or more, thousands in some cases,
Yeah.
and sometimes it feels like a lot of money. But when you see how much work goes into organizing it yourself, sometimes you realize, like, yeah,
That's a
paying
lot
for
of
aid
admin.
stations, yeah, you get a lot of value. So let me
Yeah.
just say that. So it's a lot of work, it's a lot of planning. But the biggest commitment is in doing a recce, doing a reconnaissance of the course,
Hmm.
because you're supposed to know the course inside and out. Now you can use a GPX file, but when the weather gets bad, and it gets bad in the lakes, you can't see anything. You can't see
Yeah.
more than 5 meters in front of you. In the case of my Bob, and so even having a GPX file, I mean, you're running back and forth, swerving around. The tracks are just the signals are only so accurate. You need to know that terrain, and you need to have scouted out some of the sections as well, because there are a few places that you need to make decisions on which route you're going to take. So the approach I wanted to take, and that I did end up taking, was to spend the entire month there of June leading up to my birthday, meeting people, so I could build relationships and build my team, to do a couple of fell races. I ended up just doing one, but to really get a feel for that fell running culture and the difference between that and North American trail running, or even trail running in the Alps, and then to recce the course. And then ultimately, when I did the race, and I wanted to document all of this, I wanted to tell the story of how to do it right and how to really pay homage to the traditions of the Bob, because this is more of a localized challenge. It's not something typically you get a lot of outsiders coming in and doing, with the exception of Kilian Jornet. And I wanted to experience it, but I want to experience it like a local. And that's what the locals do. They spend an entire summer, sometimes years, wrecking the course before they're ready to finally attempt it. And very few people actually succeed their first attempt. So for many people, this is a multi-year challenge. And I think I succeeded. The feedback was that I did. And I told that story, that entire process. So for me, that's the kind of project that I I feel fortunate that I can invest that much time in resources. It was an
Yeah.
extensive project, Airbnbs, car rentals, all
Yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah.
flights and stuff. Um, I was only the second Canadian. I'm now the fastest Canadian for a
Yeah.
reason to have ever done it because not many Canadians can afford to go spend a month in the lakes.
Mm.
Um, but that is the kind of project that really excites me. So I'm hoping to apply that format now too. There's other rounds in the UK, Paddy Buckley, Charlie Ramsey, and we have a similar challenge, 14,000 foot peaks called the Nolan's 14 in
Whoa.
Colorado
Yeah.
that I'd love to take on one day as well. And my approach to all those will be similar, spending at least a few weeks really sinking my teeth into the project and trying to tell the story as comprehensively as I can.
It's evident that there was such a powerful why, like pulling it back to the why behind races. That is so cool. It's almost like there's layers to the why for the Bob Graham round when it came to that one.
And I was distracted. I was working remotely. I was doing a bunch of things, but I had this project for a month that I really felt like, wow, this must be what it's like to work on a feature film where you're just like on
Yeah,
set day in, day out, just working on one project and you can't wait to see how it's going to come together, which is very different than how I typically approach my YouTube projects. So yeah, and that, I mean, I'd love to expand that and take on multi-month
yeah,
projects where I'm getting doing bigger and bigger challenges with bigger and bigger budgets. But really, it's about that focus. And I think, why am I looking for focus? I've realized it's because I have a lack of focus. Ultimately, I am trying
yeah.
to do so many things in my life and in my job and managing multiple businesses. So clearly, I gravitate towards the opportunity to focus on something for a week or a month at a time.
Absolutely. And the Lake District specifically, how did you find that the weather and the terrain compared to other areas? Because one of those nights looked pretty sketchy, man. It was raining, windy, low visibility, and you were even, I didn't realize that there was like, you were almost scrambling up like a chimney in one of the
Yeah,
parts. I didn't realize it got that technical. So, yeah, how did you find those aspects of the Lake District?
there's a couple spots on the course that are, yeah, it's a scramble, and that's a good example where there are ways around that, but they
Hmm.
add on 15 minutes. And so if you're
Ah,
not comfortable with that terrain in your recce, you can choose to go around those sections. But now then it's will you finish in under 24 hours? That's so it's that kind of toss up. Um, so the terrain is very different, as I said in the fells. It's a lot of off trail running, but the weather is very different as well. The
yeah,
Lake District is influenced by the Irish Sea, and it's much wetter and therefore also much greener than most of England. It's beautiful, waterfalls, everything's green. But the weather can be really bad, and it almost always is bad. So when I
yeah,
was there, I had about 3 weeks of sunshine. They've never had 3 weeks of sunshine, apparently, because everybody was just blown away by the weather. And what
yeah, yeah.
happened was all the bogs dried out. So the grassy stuff where normally you'd be up knee deep in mud was hard packed, fast. And all of the records have been set in those kind of conditions fast,
Right.
dry. It's hot. You have to manage your
Yeah.
hydration, your electrolytes, but you can run. It was amazing. And it also worked well for the film because I was able to get all this footage that I think a lot of people, even from the lakes, hadn't really seen the lakes in that light. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
pun intended. It was, so that worked really well, I think, for the story. But then the week of my Bob Graham, everything changed and we got
Mhm.
all the rain that we hadn't got over the last few weeks. And so my Bob Graham round was typical Lake District weather, as they'd say, which is, sideways rain, gale force winds, and,
Yeah.
so you're scrambling and then holding onto rocks because you feel like you're going to blow over.
Yeah.
Um, Visibility as low as, like I said, 5 meters in some cases where you can barely see in front of your feet. Um, so yeah, so I had both experiences, and in a way, I think, as I often will say, like I said with Moab, I think it made for a better story because had I had the sunshine, it wouldn't have been a typical Lake District experience,
Yeah.
and I would have never heard the end of it from the locals.
Yeah. 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 That's
So
so true.
I still finished it with time to spare, a couple hours to spare, just under my goal time of 22 hours. Yeah, I could have probably gone faster if it was dry. Maybe I could have shaved off a half hour to an hour. But it made for a pretty good story because it was about I had the best weather you could have had for the first 3 weeks and probably the worst weather you could have
Yeah.
had for the Bob Graham round.
It's so funny you speak to the weather because the first time we went for that overnight, like the wild camp, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
cool, we got Fairfield, like looking on all trails, and we got there and we got to Ambleside and it wasn't too cloudy there, but we could see some high cloud and oh, hopefully it's all right. Go up and then we're in the cloud at like 300, 400 meters and then we're like, nah. okay, it's bad now, but tomorrow
Hmm.
morning it's supposed to clear. It'll be great. And we got to the top of Fairfield. It was too windy. We turned back down and camped further down, like very optimistic for the morning. And I wanted that Instagram like shot where you open the tent and it's this amazing
Oh yeah.
view. And it's just like it was not the visibility was worse. It was like 5 meters, like you're saying. So
Yeah.
when I watched your video, I watched it, but then I had to show Chloe because I was like, "Look, Chloe, this is what it's supposed to look like."
Yeah.
And that practice run you did, it looked amazing, man. Like the visibility, the grass, the blue sky, and
We
then
had incredible weather, and I even made the comments, and that I think the heat is going to be the challenge because
yeah,
we
yeah,
were dying of heat, and there's not a lot of water in some places on the course. So, and that's where I would have used my pacers to help carry extra water and things. So
yeah.
it would have been a different experience, a different challenge. But no, I got what I deserved. Yeah, on my bum.
Yeah. And then we went back up to run the Fairfield loop just to do it and it was
Yeah,
windy, but there was good visibility and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it was such nice terrain when you can actually see it. But, where I thought we could go now, I'm keen to understand after going through a few specific races. I'm keen to get a bit more of an insight into some more macro level stuff when it comes to you as a person and doing these big events. And I thought one thing that I don't know, it comes across in your videos that you don't make these races look easy, but you're a very calm, relaxed person. When I think about, I don't know, someone like David Goggins who does the same thing and he's like swearing and he's yelling and he makes it sound very intense, whereas for the most part, you're very calm, very relaxed. So, how do you maintain your composure throughout these races, or do we just not see the times when you're really frustrated?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I just don't take this stuff very seriously. I don't think we should. We're paying, first of all, to do these races. We're paying good money. We're
That's a
spending a
good
lot of
point.
time. We're choosing to be out there. So
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
to spend a bunch of time complaining, who are we complaining to? What are we complaining about?
that's true.
That's that. I think that probably is the short answer to your
Yeah,
question. Um, it is hard, but these things are hard, but it's just a physical challenge. It's just so maybe it's part of that disconnecting and thinking of your body as a machine and you're controlling it, and so maybe there's a little bit of stoicism in there. I'm not too sure, but
yeah,
yeah, I mean, just again to say it like it is, it's we're paying to be out there. I think sometimes we lose perspective on that. That
yeah.
this is all supposed to be fun, and yes, it can be suffering. Yes, it can be uncomfortable, but you can stop anytime. You know?
Yeah. That is such a good point. That's funny you say that because I do think about that when, like, and it is hard. Like, I haven't done it, but you can tell that it's hard. But I do think, like, you're still voluntarily putting yourself into this discomfort. That you're not
Yeah,
having to do it to save your village or to go get water or
exactly,
something, right? You're
exactly.
still signing
Yeah,
up to do the thing.
yeah. And you know what? Some people love that David Goggins stay hard, push through kidney failure kind of mentality. It's not for me. It's not for me. And if that's what you want, my films probably aren't going to be it. I actually get that comment sometimes negatively where people say, I make it look too easy or it doesn't feel real. Like I never complain about, again, I mean, what's there to complain about? We're running and I mean, depending on which races you do, I'm choosing to
Mm,
run in some of the most beautiful places in the world. Feel very privileged to have that opportunity to do so. And I'm making a living doing it now, actually.
yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have much to complain about.
Yeah, and I
You know.
suppose it probably comes from the preparation too. It's going to be more
Sure.
difficult if you're not as fit and as conditioned.
That's a good point, actually. And that's maybe something I lose perspective on is like I have a very I'm very process oriented. So I don't just show up to races and hope I can finish them. I mean, I
Yeah.
am following a training plan where on the race day is just the last run of a series of long runs. That's all it
Hmm.
is. It's run number whatever, 82 on my training program. It's the execution part. There's no surprises there. If you've trained properly, you're going to run the race you trained for. Whereas I think people have this misunderstanding that running, and especially ultra running, is like, you do a little bit of training, but at the end of the day, it's about how hard you can push during the race. It's not about that. It's about reaching the potential you've trained your body for. And yes, you have to go to some dark places. You have to go into the pain cave, but you're not. you're not surprising yourself out there. You're hopefully just not letting yourself down. Like you're
Yeah.
hopefully saying, yes, that's the race I trained for. And I think when we're often disappointed, you hear this from elite runners all the time, where they say that's, where they're disappointed with the performance. I don't know, say somebody was hoping to win and they finished fifth place instead and they're disappointed. You often hear in those post race interviews, they'll say, like, it's not the race I trained for, but, ultimately it's what I was given. It's what my body would let me do on the day.
Yeah.
And so they're often disappointed that what they had trained for, the way they had trained, and therefore what they expected from their body didn't materialize. And I think that's the way we need to approach our training, our racing, our goal setting.
Yeah.
If we don't have time to commit to these long distances, to properly train for 100 miles, for example, don't do one. Do a 50K instead. Do something you have time to train for and do properly. Do fewer things better and do a shorter race better. So you can execute and say, that's the best 50K race I could have run. Not, well, I finished, but I didn't train properly for it. At least that's my opinion. Now, everybody
Yeah.
can choose their own, set their own goals. And maybe your goal is to do couch to 100 miles and just see if you can walk it in and finish it. But for me, that's not as satisfying. I like to be able to iterate and learn
Yeah.
from each race. And if all I've learned is I didn't train enough, I mean, how do you build on that? I'd rather be able to say, well, I could have tweaked this one training run, or I could have had more tempo runs, or I want to be able to tweak small things and improve. So that's just me. But for me, it's if you don't have time to commit to the training, don't set the goal of running the race.
Yeah, and it's like a big data component there. It's like by the time you're turning up to the start line, you have the data that
Yeah,
supports the fact that you're going to do the thing unless some anomaly happens, like you get injured, you fall over or something like that.
totally, totally. I mean, when I showed up to Moab, my goal was to finish my goal was 72 hours and I finished in 71. I
Yeah.
mean, that pretty close. And
Yeah.
that was somewhat arbitrary goal, but I knew where I was at in my fitness. And my first 100K, my goal was 10 hours and I finished in basically 10 hours. I mean, you pace it, you run the race you've trained for, and Bob Graham round, my goal was, 22 hours and I basically ran 3 minutes under that. So this is, maybe sometimes setting goals you can hold yourself back because your goal isn't aggressive enough. And that's
Yeah.
something you can learn. You can learn to set more aggressive goals, but only by achieving the ones you had set previously, not
Yeah.
by failing. We learn a lot from failure. Don't get me wrong. We learn a lot about how to improve. I think we learn more from success, from iterative success, because then we
Yeah.
can improve incrementally. It would be easier for me to go back and run Moab 1 to 4 hours faster, having now successfully finished it, than it would be to have failed and then still try to set a more aggressive goal.
Oh, that's quite a unique take. I'd say more often than not, you hear the reverse is true, where it's like it's not a loss, it's a learning, and like you learn more from losing than you do from winning. But in that instance, you can see how you're proving your plan, and then you're
Yeah.
able to improve on that plan rather than missing the goal by a wide margin.
Yeah, and you can learn from failure. Again, depending on how we define failure. I mean,
Frame it, yeah,
I think learning from failure, you can learn how to go back and achieve the goal you had originally set.
yeah,
But again, for me, if you're trying to achieve a more aggressive goal, I don't know that failure is going to teach you how to go back and set a more aggressive goal. You should then, again, if I didn't run 72 or ran 74, I should probably first try to run 72 before I try to run 70.
yeah,
Um, I think about there's a lot of things that are iterative, and I'm an iterative person, and a lot of things I do, like content creation. To make a good YouTube video, you're gonna make 20, 100 bad YouTube videos. It's just reps. That's all it is. It's reps, and eventually you'll get good at it through osmosis, by
yeah, yeah,
accident,
yeah,
through repetition, right? Having said that, there's also an idea around it's not practice. It's not 10,000 hours, as Malcolm Gladwell said incorrectly. It's
mhm,
perfect practice that we need,
yeah,
because sometimes doing the wrong thing over and over again isn't going to get you there either. And again, that's where I don't think learning from failure is necessarily the only answer. Doing the right thing over and over again and making that right thing better and better and better. You're getting better at doing it right is, I think, the way to do it. So a good example is as a guitar player, I play classical guitar as well, and I know from experience and the theory teaches you shouldn't play when you're tired. You're not going to learn. You're not going to improve. Make sure you're fresh. Take breaks, but also make sure you have good posture and good form. Don't pick up bad mistakes, you're going to commit them to muscle memory. So do it right when you're practicing. Practice properly. Practice perfectly.
Yep.
That's how you improve. Running is similar, I think, as well. We in our training, there's a time and a place to train yourself hard and into the ground, and there's a time and a place to train yourself well with good form. When you're doing speed work, for example, running on the track, that teaches you good form, and there's a neuromuscular component to that, and you need some of that as well. So practicing form, thinking about really not letting yourself get sloppy in your running is another good example. So yeah, so for me, speaking macro, I try to approach that, uh, approach my content creation that way as well. Each film, I try to learn something a little bit, improve something, whether it's the graphics or the voiceover, maybe use a little bit of a better mic. But every film, and I don't try to do 10 new things necessarily. I think that's too much. One or two things, because I'm thinking long term. I'm
Yep.
thinking 2, 3 years, 5 years down the road. If I want my content to be National Geographic level, I've got a whole film crew. I've got 5 years to get there, and working backwards, I can see how to get there. It's one or two improvements with each film.
Yeah, well, I had some friends from New Zealand staying over recently, and one in particular is really into his hiking, and he had just been in Nepal. And I don't know
Mm.
if the YouTube algorithm, I don't know how it works, man, but I was like, oh, I'm going to show him some of your stuff. And then a video of you in Nepal 9 years ago showed up, and he's like, "Oh, can we watch that one?" It's like, "Yeah, okay, cool." And I was both like impressed at how good the video was for being 9 years ago, but then could also see how much your videos have improved since then too. So that's a good little segue, actually. I think I'll be quite interested to chat about your content creation journey. So, how did it first start all the way back then, and what have been, I don't know, some of the highest level learnings that you've implemented throughout that time?
That film was one of my first films. I
Yeah.
was doing a trek in Nepal, 10 days on the Annapurna circuit, and I hadn't actually planned on making a film. I had a camera, I was taking
Ah,
stills, and kind of
yeah.
I started shooting some B-roll. And after a day or two, I thought maybe I could cut something together after this, but I didn't have a plan. I certainly didn't have a channel and a channel strategy
Yeah.
for YouTube. And then, yeah, again, about halfway through, I realized, no, I'll probably cut together a 20-minute little documentary here. And I went home and I did that. And I had to figure out how to make my maps and,
Well, that's the
how to.
part that I was so impressed with. I was like, "Whoa, you're doing the Google Map animation like 9 years ago." I don't even know how that really works now. It was so, and even your you put the animation on for where you were, like each location, and
Yeah.
it was quite detailed for something that. Oh, that's crazy that you just threw that together too. I'm even more impressed now.
Well, I should say though, or I should remind everyone, like that, as I said, I've been doing this my whole life. So I've had a
True.
camera in my hand since I was 15, and been running a video production agency for now 20 years, my entire
Wow.
working career. So it's not that I didn't have the video skills for it, but YouTube, that form of storytelling, every format really, documentary, music videos, whatever you're doing, there's a learning curve there. It's a new
Yeah.
format. You have to learn what works. And so I've been learning a lot about what works on YouTube and how to do it efficiently, effectively.
Yep.
Not spending too much time. I mean, a lot of the work I do with the agency, I don't do animation. We hire animators
Hmm.
for that. So I've had to figure out how to do some of that myself. But the fundamentals I had. I mean, I knew how to use a camera. Having said that, a lot of the equipment we're using, especially 9 years ago, it was big cameras, like
Yeah. Did you really
professional
have like
stuff.
GoPros or anything?
Well, for that one, I had the Canon 7D, which was one of the
Ah,
first DSLRs, and
yeah.
at the time was very high quality, 720p.
Yeah.
But
Damn.
a very good camera at the time, and I was using vintage lenses for that trip, vintage
Yeah.
prime lenses from
Oh,
old film
wow.
cameras,
Yeah.
which weren't even compatible with the camera I was having to. Anyway,
Uh,
um,
yeah.
it's all to say that even things like the GoPro, they've evolved with my career as a content creator. And so I published that film. It's gotten 2.5 million views or something at
I
this point.
know, it's crazy, man. I saw
It's crazy,
maybe
right?
that's
Yeah.
why it popped up, but yeah, I thought so.
I think it was the right place at the right time, but also that it happens to be probably the most popular trek in the world. And
Yeah.
that taught me something, that a lesson that stayed with me, which is if you want to scale and make money off this, you can't make a living filming local 50K races
Yeah.
or hikes in your backyard. You do
Yeah.
have to go, if you're trying to target search, that is at least, you
Yeah.
do have to kind of go big.
Yeah.
You need some hits, and for me,
Yeah.
that's that. We can talk about UTMB, for example. That's the biggest race in the world. Also, my most popular. That's up to a couple million views as well. My most
Yeah.
popular race film. But fast forward a few years, I put that up. I filmed another few. I started running right around that time, and I started doing some filming of races as well. But the problem was I couldn't carry my DSLR. I had to carry a GoPro, and the GoPro was really bad back then.
Hmm.
The GoPro 4, and
Was it
it
the
just
like
didn't
those
look great.
when they were silver? Was it
The
those silver
silver ones,
ones with a
yeah.
case if you wanted to go in the water and
I
all
still,
that?
I'm looking over here. I still have my old GoPros on a shelf.
Yeah.
Um, but I wasn't taking it very seriously because I didn't feel that the quality was there as a professional. And having said that, looking back, that was a missed opportunity. I should have been working on my storytelling because cameras don't
Hmm.
matter, gear doesn't matter. It's the story. It's the because at the time, Ethan Newberry, Ginger Runner, who was a popular and still is a popular content creator, he was having a very much a first mover's advantage, creating content in the space, documenting his races and things, and he was doing it with those GoPros. So having said that, if you fast forward a few years, I then started getting into longer races and was running my first 200-mile race, as I said, Tor Des Geants, and that was in 2018. And so I decided to document that one. And I actually didn't publish that film for a good year and a half until after I'd run my second one, Swiss Peaks 360K, which I also documented. When I put those two films up, those kind of launched the YouTube channel because all of a sudden I had this trail running audience as well. And that sort of led me to realize like maybe I have a voice here. I'm doing something unique, which is running these really long races. And it just happens that at that time the GoPro 6 had been released, which
Oh,
was a
nice.
huge step up. And
Yeah.
so as much as I say it's not about the gear, there's a minimum threshold here. It's easier to say that now because the gear is so good, it almost doesn't matter. You can
Yeah.
film a feature, you can film an entire film or video on an iPhone.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was maybe not quite so.
Not
But
there
that
yet.
GoPro
Yeah.
6 really changed things for me. And that's when I realized like I can take maybe what I know about using big cameras and storytelling and filmmaking and try to apply that and improve on it in the YouTube space. And the rest is history. I've been kind of filming my races since then and growing an audience. And doing those big races has given me credibility. So when I talk about gear and tips and do anything that way, people listen and they want to know what bag did you use, what shoes did you use, and that creates
Yeah.
other type of content I can create as well, reviews and things. But yeah, that was really that Nepal video kind of was almost the initial proving grounds for me. But it was years before I then leaned into the trail running and found my niche, I guess, and kind of found my voice there.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there by talking to the storytelling. I think that's exactly why I watch your videos. Like, obviously, because you're doing some crazy long distances or you're in some beautiful places, but it's the way you tell the story. It's not like, okay, the race has started. Now I'm at the top of the hill. Now I'm down the hill. Like, you're not just saying this and then this and then this, which I feel like, at least when people start out, is quite typical. That they're not trying to do that storytelling thing, but the whole reason why I think I enjoy your videos so much is purely down to the story that you tell. And is that kind of would you say that's a skill that you've worked on uh, over time as well? I bet like I don't know, telling a compelling story is quite difficult, especially when maybe you know the topic very well too, or maybe you might not see it as the most interesting thing and you got to try and craft a story out of it. So maybe to make it more tangible, actually, do you have any tips on telling a good story?
Well, I mean, I'm still learning, and again, I think telling a story on a platform like YouTube has its own quirks.
Yeah.
Telling a story for television, we recognize those formats. They're typically 30-minute episodes, really about 23 minutes of content, 22 minutes of content with 2-minute commercial breaks every 7 minutes or so. You have to hook the person before the commercial break and make sure they come back and watch it afterwards. So there's these pretty established formats, including starting it with a bit of a trailer. Most TV shows kind of say,
Yeah.
in this episode, you're going to see. So I took a lot of those, I guess you could call them tropes from television. Why
Hmm.
reinvent the wheel? And I've been trying to apply those to YouTube. So starting my films with a bit of a preview of what you're going to see before I launch into it, because otherwise there's no context. There's no, I got to get the person hooked.
Yeah.
But then you have to keep re-engaging them as well. So there's the idea of opening new loops. So the first minute, that opener to me hopefully opens a loop. It's and I you know can I finish, or what, whatever the story's about. And then you think, man, I want to see if he can finish or not. And then throughout the story, though, you have to re-engage. So it's opening new loops, getting up to the top of the mountain, like, oh shoot, that storm cloud looks like it's moving in. I wonder if
Yeah,
this
yeah,
lightning
yeah.
storm's gonna hit us. You've opened a new loop, so now the viewer's like, okay, I'll watch for another couple minutes. I want to see what happens to that lightning storm. So you're layering on, you're raising the stakes as you go. If you watch Lord of the Rings, I mean, there's the macro challenge. We're trying to do this big adventure and get to the other side. But then there's smaller challenges that come up as well. Like, oh shoot, we have to cross this cliff, or we have to do this. So they open new loops throughout
Mhm.
it. There's the big loop, and then there's the small open loops. Humans have a natural tendency. We want to close loops. We don't like unanswered questions. And that's why we'll stick around. We want to close those loops. And at the end of the story, you close the big loop, which is, can I finish? Can I hit this goal time? Whatever it might be. So thinking about whether you want to call it raising the stakes, opening new loops, that's something we try to practice. I say my partner Adriana, she's involved in our storytelling as well in our films. Um, Foreshadowing is really an example of that.
Yeah.
You're opening a loop. You're foreshadowing something that might happen. You could just tell it as it's happening, but by foreshadowing, you're opening a loop and keeping the viewer engaged. So it's different than information telling.
Yeah,
Storytelling is
exactly.
different than information telling.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And also, it's not truth telling. So,
Yeah.
not that I ever lie in my stories or fabricate things, but I might embellish things. I might play up things that
Mhm.
in the moment I'm like, I know this probably isn't going to be a big deal, but I'll maybe play it up a little bit just to
Yeah,
create a little bit of tension.
yeah.
Because, like I said, it's not truth telling, it's not information telling, it's storytelling.
That is such a good way of articulating it, opening more and more loops to keep you hooked, because that would be precisely why they're so engaging. And that's like that direct contrast between the information telling. I got up here at 7 a.m. and then I was here at 9 a.m. and that's very boring and, like, I suppose maybe linear, whereas like closing and opening new loops, it's more of a journey for the viewer.
Well, and I have a lot to learn, I think, still from other YouTubers. So if you look at one of the most popular formats on YouTube is the challenge video, right? So it's,
Yeah,
I'm gonna try to do this, and I'm gonna
Mr.
try
Beast.
to, yeah, Mr. Beast, exactly. And what
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
doing is in the first 10 seconds, he's opening a loop. Can I
Hmm.
do this challenge? And I guess you could argue that as runners, we have this built in to our stories. It's, can I finish the race? Or
Yeah,
can I win the race, or whatever your goal might be. So that's built into the format. But unfortunately, that can get a little repetitive. And it can also, I think at some point you're like, I know he's going to finish. Come on,
yeah. The
I've seen him
data
do it
would
20
suggest that.
times.
Yeah,
The data would
exactly.
suggest that, yeah. So I need to start thinking about how I can tell more unique stories. And I would actually argue this goes exactly back to what we were talking about, which is the why. The
Mm,
why am I even doing this race in the first place is
yeah,
similar to why should you follow the story. At some point, I've been there, done that. I know I can do 100 miles. The question is, can I do it faster? Can I win? Can I? So, in the same way you want to raise the stakes, maybe for the audience, and choose your stories wisely, craft your stories strategically.
yeah,
That speaks to why are you doing the race in the first place? At least for me, because I always want to try a new challenge in a new place with some new element. Doing a race that's the longest race I've ever done. Can I finish a 400-mile race? I actually I don't know, and then the viewer won't know either, and they'll want to
yeah,
watch that story. So it directly crosses over to what we were talking about with choosing having a why for doing the challenge in the first place.
yeah.
And it just happens that I'm looking for new, unique challenges. So again, I said, like, I'd love to run a race like, say, Badwater, because I want to see if I can run in the hottest place in the world. And I think the viewer will be interested in seeing if I can as well.
100%. Like when you mentioned that, because I've listened to Goggins' book and his story of Badwater when he's like running through Death Valley and there's the flies and it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit. What's that, like 40 plus degrees or something? That is a story, man. Whether you can or you can't do it, it's a story either way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. As
That's
opposed
so
to just
fun.
doing the same old,
Yeah, I'm
hey, I'm
doing
going
the
back to
you.
run this race for the fourth time.
Yeah, gonna do the UTMB again.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
exactly. That's a good point. So I would like to run UTMB again one day, but I think the reason I would do it is because I want to do it faster. I wasn't really
Yeah.
happy with my time there, mostly because I didn't train properly for it. I'd been training for a different race that was more runnable. I didn't have the mountain legs for UTMB. So as I said, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't really disappointed. More just in hindsight, I realized I know where I could improve. It would be in my training, more mountain time. I'd go and train in the Alps for 3 months, and then that's why I would go back, and that would be my why for being there and trying to finish
Mm.
would be to try to shave off a good 4 hours in that race. And I would only do it if I was prepared and in a place where I could do that. Otherwise, what's the point of going back? And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
similarly, I thought, well, do people want to see that story again? Well, I think only if I was to lean into that aspect
Yeah,
enough, where
yeah.
it's like, this is about speed this time. This isn't about enjoying it and soaking it in and high fiving people along the way. This is about performance. And I think, therefore, I would probably have to do less GoPro filming and have more camera people on the course where people
Yeah,
would see it. Yes, he looks focused. He's not screwing around with the GoPro. He's racing. And we'd tell the story in a different way. But that could be the story of my return to UTMB. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother doing it, or at least I wouldn't bother telling a story about it. But also, I
yeah.
don't think I'd bother doing it because what I've done it once. I would only go back if there was something there more there for
Yeah.
me. What would the why be for going back?
See, already I'm hooked. If you said you were going there to do it, it's kind of like a Moab kind of vibe, I suppose. Like we're not going here to muck around, like we're going here
That's right.
to
That's the story,
compete.
right?
Yeah,
It's storytelling. So I don't think this stuff's rocket science. I have a lot to improve on this, all this stuff. I hope to. That's one of the biggest things I want to improve on. Production value. We got the drones. We got all that stuff. I mean, I'm getting diminishing returns. I feel like at some point, it's the storytelling, and
yeah,
sometimes it might mean making shorter films as well. I mean, I do have films that are up to 90 minutes long that tell the story of a 7 day stage race, and a lot of my films are in the 60 to 75 minute range. But maybe these would be more compelling stories if they were simpler stories. They don't have to be 4 days of racing. It can be, but with a more specific challenge. And maybe I could
yeah,
tell more compelling stories that are 25 minutes long, but more of them that are about one thing, one challenge, one, pulling over in the side of the road because I see on Strava that somebody has a crown on a hill. Can I go and take that crown?
yes,
Just something
yeah,
simple
yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Practicing with shorter, more snappy formats, I think, is something I'd like to do in the future.
yeah. It must be a bit of a balance between like I don't know, giving into the algorithm a little bit that likes
Yeah.
those kind of things, but then people who are really into your content, like I would happily sit down and watch a 90-minute film, or maybe I'd break it up into two or three segments, but like sitting down and watching that because you want more of the detail, but then I don't know, maybe the algorithm promotes more of the shorter, snappier stuff that like
Yeah.
maybe that'll get people hooked and then they want to watch the longer stuff. So
No, exactly. And it's also to be authentic to myself, like true to myself. What I really want to do is big challenges that take a month. And then I
yeah,
want to tell the story of that month, like the Bob Graham round. It would be
yeah,
hard to have split that up into multiple videos because it really was the story of me spending a month soaking it in and embedding myself in that challenge. So um, there's also another reason as well, which if we want to get into the economics of YouTube a little bit,
hmm,
my business model mostly revolves around ads.
yeah,
I generate most of my revenue as a business from AdWords, which is the programmatic ads. Those are the ads that are automatically placed. When I
yeah.
say automatically, I actually choose where the ads go, and I actually edit my films
Mm.
for ad placements.
It's
So
like an
there's
actual
almost always
commercial break.
it's a commercial break,
Yeah,
exactly. Television's been doing it for decades, and I do the
yeah,
same thing. So I put them in every maybe 10 minutes or so. Typically, there's a fade to black, so it doesn't disrupt the story. And sometimes I use them strategically where I want time to feel like it's passing, like it's night into day. And I want you to have
yeah,
to take a second and, okay, let's watch a commercial, come back, and 8 hours has passed in the story. So I actually sometimes use commercials that way strategically. At least I hope it feels that way.
yeah,
Um, but those commercial breaks, basically, the more you can put into a film, the more money you make.
yeah,
So a million views on a 10-minute video compared to a million views on a 90-minute video, that's night and day. Because
yeah.
you might be able to put 8 commercial breaks in the
Ah,
in
I
the former.
see. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Assuming that people are viewing it all the way through.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
that's the trick is can
yeah,
you keep people's attention for 90 minutes?
yeah,
That's finding the balance.
yeah,
Or do you tell 9 times the stories in volume that are 10 minutes long, but people watch them all and they just binge them all.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
there's
yeah.
no right answer to that. It comes down to watch time. So it's not about views, it's not about number of videos, it's watch time. How many hours are people spending engaging with your content, or minutes, and how many commercial breaks are you showing them? And there's a trade-off in value there. And I think people are willing to watch commercials provided the stories are compelling enough and that they're getting enough value, because we've been doing it for decades on
Yeah.
television. There's other ways to monetize. You don't have to show commercials. We often also see product placements and what are called integrations, where you literally do an ad read on camera.
Yeah.
And some people upsell with coaching services and other things as well. So there's different ways to monetize. Right now, the AdWords just happens to be what's funding our business for the most part. Um, we'll see if we can move away from that, but that's another reason strategically anyway why telling longer stories works. So a little bit of
Yeah.
inside baseball there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And think, I don't know, maybe when did YouTube come out? Maybe 15 years ago or something. Like, imagine before that, you couldn't, the means of turning your passion into some kind of profession and building leverage through an
Yeah.
audience, that whole concept wouldn't even really exist. I don't know, maybe you'd do it, what, through a magazine or something. I don't
Well,
know.
you had gatekeepers. You had to pitch a show to a
Exactly.
broadcaster, and it was the same thing. You were pitching content. They were thinking, is this content compelling enough that we can put ads in it? That's all they
Yeah.
were thinking.
Yeah, yeah,
How many
yeah.
ads can we sell? And if your content was compelling enough, the audience was going to watch it. They could sell ad space, then yeah, they'll greenlight it. Whereas now there's no middleman anymore. But this it's the same idea. This content I'm spending all this time creating, we're both the creator and the publisher.
Hmm.
Um, is this going to allow me to place ads in it? We need to be thinking about it from both sides if we want to be sustainable. I mean, this is the thing. A lot of people might be thinking, like, why is he so money focused? Well, we're this is a full time job,
Yeah.
and we have a lot of costs as well. And I want to do this for years to come, and I want to improve the stories and inspire more people, reach more
Yeah.
people, and grow my audience. So this needs to be a sustainable business for that to happen, and so we can hire people to help us as well. And so in the past, as you said, that was only, YouTube was created and I think launched in 2005 or something, 2006, and but the creator program, where you could get paid, actually is much more recent. So
Ah,
this is a
right.
pretty new thing,
Yeah.
relatively speaking. And it is incredible that as a creator, I can make a video, publish it the next day. As soon as I'm done, there's nobody approving it. There's nobody
Yeah.
gatekeeping it.
You don't have to
And
pay YouTube to
I don't have
publish
to
it
pay
or something.
YouTube. They
Yeah.
just send me a check.
Yeah.
It's an incredible empowerment as an independent content creator.
Yeah.
It really is special that you just get a check. But also more than that, I don't have to negotiate with sponsors. So I don't have to create deals and invoice them and wait for payment. This just all happens automatically. And
Yeah.
so while a lot of creators rely on the integrations and the brand partnerships and all these things, and we've experimented with that as well, for sure. And I have some ongoing sponsorships. There's a lot of work with that as well. And you end up spending a lot of time and energy on the brand deals. Whereas this way, you can just focus on making compelling content. I think it's a
Yeah.
win-win for the audience and for the creator if you can make it work, because it just sort of happens automatically with no extra energy spent on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pull it back a little bit. When you're talking about doing big challenges, I just had a thought. What do you think of big challenges like, say, the hardest geezer, Russ Cook, who went from the bottom of South Africa, bottom of Africa to the
Yeah.
top of Africa? Like, what do you think of those kind of challenges? Is it maybe not on that scale, perhaps, but is it that kind of idea? And yeah, what do you think of people doing those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's cool. I have some big fast packs I'd love to do, like for example, running the Jordan Trail across the country of Jordan. There's some of these routes that are, I mean, doing something like the PCT, for example, the Pacific
Yeah,
Crest Trail, where we're talking about weeks, if not months, embedding yourself in a challenge. And I think that the only sort of problem there, the only challenge there from a business standpoint is, okay, are we making one film about that? That takes months to
yeah,
produce because there's an
yeah,
opportunity cost there. Or are we making then a series where there's deliverables happening along the way? Okay, well, who's going to be creating those while I'm out running every day? Now,
yeah.
I have to hire, like Russ had, content team
Oh,
with
creative
him,
team. Yeah,
a
yeah,
creator team. Whereas
yeah.
for me, that my channel, I'm an athlete, but first and foremost, I'm a creator. It's my
Ah,
voice and vision and creative work. So I struggle with that a little bit. It's the finding a balance between, you know, these really big challenges. Because as much as I spent a month doing the Bob Graham round, I mean, I was living in an Airbnb. I was editing and working on the
Comfortable.
project
Yeah,
comfortable.
yeah,
I
yeah.
wasn't on trail for a month. The
Yeah,
challenge itself was only 24 hours
yeah.
at the end of that process. So I'm trying to find a balance there where I could maybe take on some of these bigger challenges that really satisfy me personally, that I think people would be interested in,
Yeah.
but would potentially only result in one piece of content. One of my
Mm.
favorite films is from a guy. This is years old. I think this is a 10-year-old film at this point, and I forget his name. But if you search for it, uh, I'll tell you about it, and hopefully I can think of what people should search for. He bought
Yeah.
a bike, I believe, a giant bike, and he bought
Yeah.
it from. It's manufactured in China, and I think he lives in the UK.
Oh, I think
And
I know
instead
what
of
you're
having
gonna
it
talk
shipped
about.
to him, he said, "Why don't I go
Yes.
pick it up from the factory?" Yeah, you see what I'm saying? And he
Yeah.
biked all the way home, and
Insane.
it took him a year.
Yeah.
Of course, he didn't take the most direct line, and so it was obviously it wasn't about the bike, it wasn't about the factory, but they did a whole welcome reception for him, and he documented in one of the most incredible ways. And if I remember correctly, the entire film was only about 20 minutes,
Hmm.
and it took him a year to produce.
Whoa.
Now he's gotten millions of views off that, but he's not exactly making a living off that video.
Yeah.
That was very much a passion project. So that's an extreme example of spending a year for a 20-minute piece of content. That's not a sustainable business,
Hmm.
as compelling as that would be. And so I don't really have an answer for you, but it's kind of there's finding that balance between the
Yeah.
investment of time and the amount of content you can create, as well as balancing other commitments in life. One of the reasons I can do this is because I do also run a video production agency that I'm
Hmm.
able to do remotely as we travel. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I was running across Africa. So now I'm actually having to take a leave from that business, and I'm then making other sacrifices as well. So yeah, I'd love to do big things like that, but I'd be interested to see what Russ does now, for example.
Yeah. I saw what did he launch recently? He launched and it was like a I think it's for free too, but he's doing
Okay,
basically putting on expeditions for people.
cool.
And he's taking people on expeditions, but I've seen him floating some crazy ideas, like going from the South Pole to the North Pole and swimming over the Darien Gap. Oh, not the Darien
Yeah,
Gap, so that's South America. What's the sea down by Antarctica? But yeah, I don't know if he's going to do those or not, but I see him floating some crazy ideas around. But yeah, that is a good point. Like, what's the balance or the ROI on the time investment? Something like that. Yeah.
yeah, and also it's you know, maybe it's quality over quantity. Do you go, a mile deep or into one challenge, or an inch deep into a bunch of challenges?
Yeah.
I think it's a happy medium there as well for me personally. So forgetting about the content side, I'd love to do a half dozen big challenges all around the world in a year, maybe than one big one. I think
Yeah.
I think that might be more satisfying. It also spreads your risk around a little bit more of failure, which is I
Yeah.
think an important thing, even just psychologically, like putting all your eggs in one basket, where if you get hurt, that entire challenge, that entire season is for nothing. Well,
Yeah.
not for nothing, but you'll have failed versus doing a few challenges where you maybe have a second go at it, later on
Yeah.
in the year. So I think that's yeah, that comes back down to goal setting, and it's got to excite you. It's got as a person.
Mhm.
It can't just be about content, and I can definitely say that what excites me is doing multi-week challenges at this point. I'd love to do something that was say 20 days, maybe 30 days out on a trail
Yeah.
the whole time and see how that feels as the next step.
There's a trail that runs from the top of the North Island of New Zealand to the bottom of the
Yeah.
South Island. I don't know what's the typical. I feel like the typical time on that's like 4 months, but surely you'd be able to run it in 8 weeks or 10 weeks or something.
A guy named Cam, I forget his last name. Maybe you know who I'm talking about. He's a creator. Did it recently. He's on the PCT
Oh,
now.
did he? Oh, is he? I
Yeah,
don't.
created some great content from it. But yeah, that's a good example of we have that on our list for
Yeah.
sure.
I feel like New
Um,
Zealand's pretty
yeah,
clickable too. Any New
yeah,
Zealand content that pops up on my YouTube seems to have a whole bunch of views.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've yet to go there. It's on the list for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought maybe a final question. Obviously, we've been talking about running a lot. So, from a high level perspective, where do you think you would be now if you didn't find running? What was it, 14 years ago or 16 years ago? Where do you think you would be now?
I like to think I would have found some other sport. Yeah, I was hiking a bit at the time. Maybe I would have started rock climbing or something. Who knows? But um, I definitely would be in a different place. My social group would be different. I can tell you that much. I wouldn't have my health in the way that I do now. But and even confidence. I think there's a lot of confidence in feeling like an athlete, whether you're lifting regularly or running, whatever you're doing, feeling like you could get up and pick something up or run and feeling like you're in that kind of top 1% of the
Yeah,
population.
yeah, yeah.
It just gives you a certain sense of confidence as well. Um, and but for me, it's really the most life changing part has been that combination, combining my two passions of storytelling and filmmaking with running. That's really been the intersection where if I didn't have that, I'd be missing something. Running my business, what I was lacking was a creative output. I hadn't touched a camera in years because that's not my job anymore. And that is the piece that was missing, is the storytelling part. So if in 5 or 10 years I can't run for some reason, I'll be doing something adventure
Hmm.
oriented, and my content will follow that. Whether we're bike packing, that's maybe something I'd like to
Yeah.
lean into. I love the idea of bike packing, long distance biking, but with backpacks, basically with
Hmm.
ultralight gear. I don't know, doing a long distance rafting trip. I think would make a compelling
Yeah.
film. I mean, there's all these ways we could tell very similar stories, very similar challenges, probably mostly endurance based. Even just a long walk. I mean, walking across a country over 6 months, like we talked about, would be so. Even not if, but when I can't run anymore, whether I'm 50, 60, 70 at that time, who knows? We'll see. Hopefully not for a long time. I'll probably end up shifting that creative output to documenting other types of adventures. But I know I'll always want to be telling stories and creating content. That I
Mm.
know because that's been the biggest benefit for me in this entire process.
It's like if you imagined it like a Venn diagram, is the Japanese word for it? It's like ikigai or something like that. Probably butchered it, but it's something to do with where your skills and your talents meet
Yeah,
your passion. And I
that's right.
suppose the third element in there is that you can actually make money from it too, because at the end of the
Yeah,
day, we all need to have some money. So it's like
yeah, yeah,
finding that spot in the middle, and it's almost like that running for you is a bit of a puzzle piece where yep, that's the piece in there right now, but it could be swapped out or interchanged with something else that still lines up with those other two areas.
yeah. And I would even add to that. So you mentioned the skills. It's we like being good at something, right?
Yeah.
We often, I think, that idea of like follow your passion. I've heard it said also, follow what you're good at. You'll become passionate at it because
Yes.
you're good at it. You'll get positive feedback. It feels good to be good at something, right?
Yeah.
Um, but also I think it's are you learning? Are you
Hmm.
challenging yourself? And I'm a lifelong learner, and I'm learning about my body, and I'm learning about sport all the time. I'm learning about filmmaking. I feel like every day, like I said, I can iterate still. I'm not done learning by any means, and I'm certainly learning about the world as we travel. I mean, man, like the amount of research we're doing now on some of these films, I'm really studying a place and trying to learn pronunciation,
Yeah.
so that to me is also really exciting. It's the learning opportunity. Um, and, for me, even it might be leaning into the science side of sport. I'm not an expert, but I'd like to learn. So maybe it is sort of that Mythbusters style or science versus where I'm, supersizing myself, supersize me, but in
Yes.
sports and trying to learn through that and creating content about, how as an aging athlete can I keep competing and keep doing these big things and putting myself in the lab and talking to experts. I mean, that's a content format I could see exploring more, for example. So yeah, I think challenging yourself and learning is another component to that I would add. For me at least, that's important.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so many content creators are coming to mind when you're mentioning all these things like the bike packing. I can't remember his name. I watched him a couple of years ago, but he bike packed from the bottom of South America. Was it even up through the state? I think he was at bottom of South America to Canada, maybe. And he did maybe a 3 or 4 part series on
Yeah.
that, and it was awesome. And he must be like a filmmaker, like with similar skills, where he's obviously a professional at the thing because it was really high quality. But then
Well, I'll give a shout out real quick to a couple content creators.
yeah,
One
yeah,
is Ryan Van Duzer. Haven't actually met Ryan. He's from, I think, Colorado. And he does some ultra running content, but also a lot of bike packing content. So if you're interested in
mm,
that, really seems like a really nice guy. And
yeah,
he does some very long bike packs. And another is Jenny Tuff. And
hmm,
Jenny is a mountain athlete. She does a lot of fast packing and a lot of bike packing, big stuff all over the world, much bigger than the challenges I take on. She has a YouTube channel, so she makes films as well. Her channel's not quite as big; it hasn't found quite the success that I think she deserves,
hmm,
but especially as a female content creator. So, I think she deserves a lot more. And again, bike packing, really cool stuff. So I would check out those
yeah.
two if you're interested. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks, man. I always love recommendations. I feel like that's the best way to find content creators. And then the last one I'd mention is Nick Beer. He's a hybrid athlete. I don't know if you know him, CEO of
Yep.
BPN, and his content is so good at telling the story of the journey to the event. And like you're saying, the expert, he's doing high rocks right now. So he
Mm-hmm.
brought in a rowing coach to help him with his rowing form. And that was the main bulk of the episode is, okay, my
Yeah.
rowing sucks. So I brought in this expert and we're going to get better at rowing together. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool hearing all those.
Nick's content, I think, is a great case study. It's not so much, it's not for me, the
Mm,
content, but having said that, I think it's a great, lots can be learned from a business standpoint because I mean, there's a whole brand behind it, right? His
absolutely.
supplements that he
Yeah.
sells, and it's almost like it was brand first and then content on top of that. The
Hmm.
content is there to sell the brand, but the
Yeah.
content could stand alone. I mean, it's so good.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And then to wrap it up, I can't believe it's been an hour 40 minutes. It's been fun, man. To wrap it up, I don't know how much you can tell us, but what is on the cards? What's coming up? What have you got in the pipeline that you can let us know about?
I've got a bunch of films from this season. I think I mentioned we often will spend good 6 months of the year traveling and racing and doing adventures, documenting it all. And then I spent about 6 months hibernating as I try to get through the edits.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple coming up from Colorado. One called Soft Rock, which is about fast packing the Hard Rock 100 course. And
Yeah.
I'm quite
I was
excited
gonna
about
say
this one.
soft rock. That's funny. I was like,
Yeah,
what? There's a hard rock. I like that.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so we did it over 4 days, staying in
Nice.
actually camping and then staying in hotels as well.
Oh, cool.
Man, that course is one of the most beautiful in the world. It is one of the hardest races to get into, as you said. What we didn't say was you have less than 1% chance of getting in your first time trying
Oh,
in the lottery,
wow.
and your odds slowly
Damn.
improve.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed I get in this year. I'm up to about a 25% chance after 8 times applying
Far out.
over the course of 10 years. So if I get in this year, that film is going to be one to watch. Uh,
Epic.
we'll be filming it this coming July. But from this past season, we have one of fast packing the course. And that I'm going to be really, really proud to showcase how beautiful the course is during the day, over the course of 4 days, because I collaborated again with my friend Derek Lytle on that one, who helped me film the Moab 240 film.
Oh,
And so it's
nice.
got some great drone footage, and we suffered
Yeah.
in one of the most beautiful places at altitude. So yeah, I think definitely stay tuned for that one.
Epic. I'm looking forward to all of the above, man. That sounds really exciting. Fingers crossed for you to get into it. That would be an epic film to.
It's going to be the end as well for me. Maybe not the end, but closing out a chapter of trying to get into hard rock, which I'd almost say is a through line story of my channel and my running
Yeah.
career. Since I ran my first 100 miler, I've been every 100 miler I've done has mostly been a hard rock qualifier to try to allow me to get back into the lottery. And so it's almost like I can then move on to other challenges and yeah, I feel like I feel like everything's been almost a series, episodic leading
It's
up
like
to this
the
moment.
loops again. Like that would be
Yeah,
closing a massive loop on the
that's a
content.
massive, exactly. That's a massive, massive 10-year loop on my running story and on my this story of my channel. So hopefully
Yeah.
2025.
Fingers crossed, man. I genuinely appreciate your time. I was so stoked to be able to to be able to just chat to you. Honestly, I've been following you, watching your stuff, so it's awesome to actually get the opportunity to sit down and chat and get a little insight into your world.
This has been fun. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries, man.